So at the start of this chapter, we see that Jesus knows that he's made a significant stir amongst the people in Jerusalem. And so much so that he knows it is dangerous for him to be going there. He's said a number of things, he's done a number of things that have enraged the authorities and made them suspicious that he might be a false teacher of some sort, especially in regards to the way he treats the law and particularly the Sabbath. But it's nearly time for another big festival, and this one is called the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles. So we might call it the Festival of Tents. People would make homemade temporary shelters out of whatever was to hand at home. They'd set up outside for meals and maybe even sleeping underneath them during the season. And it was to remind people of the time when their ancestors had left Egypt and were wandering in the desert wilderness in tents and in tabernacles. And it was all about God's provision of life-giving resources in that desert. It was also an agricultural festival around harvest time, celebrating the harvest of grapes and olives in particular. It was an incredibly popular festival and celebration, and tens of thousands of revelers would swarm to Jerusalem for dancing, for music, for feasting, for the lighting of lamps and torchlight processions that ultimately ended up at the end of the festival with the temple priests pouring out wine and water all around the temple altar. And this festival lasted 8 days, starting with one Sabbath, and then on its highest day, the last day of the festival, ending on another. And Jesus' brothers here are encouraging Jesus to go to the festival. And this is more than just, oh, go on, Jesus, it'll be a great time. It's not just for the celebrations. Theirs is a strategic suggestion to him, to their wonder-working older brother. It would make sense to capitalise on the crowds and the national fervour to parade into the festival and proclaim your message. But Jesus says no, even though it kind of makes strategic sense. But for Jesus, the time was not right. The kairos wasn't right. Neither was the manner or the motive for doing this. It says they still didn't believe who he was. So Jesus tells his brothers to go to the festival. He wasn't going, but then he does go. So what are we dealing with here? Is Jesus not telling the truth? Is he being purposefully deceptive? Did he just change his mind? Well, the Greek gives us a little bit of insight, and the NIV inserts the word yet. I'm not going up yet. And it kind of implies actually in the Greek that it's not time yet. But to understand where Jesus' real reluctance to join them comes from can be found a number of years prior to this event, and a few chapters back, and most in detail in other Gospels. For in the other Gospels we have accounts of the temptations of Jesus that he experienced at the very start of his ministry, and the core of these trials were to tempt Jesus to show off and to use his power and authority for himself. To another way to explain it, to take the easy and worldly route to glory, power and dominion. And if Jesus had caved at that point, then it would have been mission over. And this episode, at the start of Jesus' life, it certainly wouldn't have been the only time Jesus experienced temptation, certainly not about this particular aspect. In one place it says the devil left him until an opportune moment. And here is one of those opportune moments. The temptation laid out by Jesus' very own family is to take that ease and fame and glory-filled way and not the way that Jesus knows that he needs to take and when he needs to take it. If Jesus had gone with his brother's suggestion, it would have involved a caravan of people travelling from the north to Jerusalem, probably picking up other revelers along the way. And with Jesus doing his ministry and his miracles and his teaching along the way, publicly, they'd eventually arrive in Jerusalem. You could imagine the fervour of the crowd following him, and it would be more akin to the triumphal entry, but this time it would be more likely to cause revolt and war. And Jesus, if successful in taking the throne that way by force, there would be no cross at the end of it. Again, it would be mission over. It was not the right time or conditions. It wasn't the right kairos moment. But Jesus does arrive at the festival in secret. And only at the halfway point does he start his teaching in the temple. And it's impressive. It really impacts people around them. And they can't get over, how can this Galilean know and understand so much? He hasn't got a degree in theology. He's not been trained. How does he know? And Jesus' response is that it's not about him. It's actually not about his credit, but the one who sent him. It's his teaching. All the time, Jesus is referring back to the Father, to the one who sent him. And this backs up why Jesus didn't go with his brother's plans, because it was not God's plan. And throughout the rest of the chapter, we see a number of places that demonstrate this split in opinions and understandings about Jesus in response to what he does and what he says. And it ultimately boils down to one simple and eternal question. Who is this Jesus? In fact, Jesus asks in other places, who do you say that I am? And in the midst of this, in chapter 7, he's actually accused of being demon-possessed because of some of the things that he's saying. Because he says, what I'm saying is so potent and challenging, people want to kill me for it. But then he criticizes how people are using the law. They're using it inconsistently. Particularly around the Sabbath, he's saying if circumcision is allowed on the Sabbath day, then why isn't healing, which is about full restoration? And all of this wind the people up, especially the religious authorities. No one enjoys being corrected publicly, even more so if you're meant to be the authority. And even more than that, by an uneducated northern rabble-rouser. But in spite of the desire to arrest him, to kill him, no one touches him. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, and generally as we've been saying, it was not the right time. It wasn't in God's timing for this to happen. Although this does mark almost like the beginning to the run-up to Jesus' final Passover. This is the autumn. The next festival along is the festival of dedication, Hanukkah, which is in the winter. That's in chapter 10. And then we make our way to the Passover in chapter 12, and that is the right time. The second reason why Jesus kind of escapes harm-free is because in verse 45 and 46, those who are sent to arrest him are so taken with what Jesus says, they can't bring themselves to arrest him. They're so flabbergasted, saying, how is he teaching this? They're saying that no one has ever spoken the way that this man does. They're so impressed. He's got a different kind of authority. But as we look around the different masses, as through this chapter shows so many people's different opinions of Jesus, because there were such diverse views about him. He must be demon-possessed for what he's saying. He's crazy. Or he doesn't fit the mold that we've got for this iconic Messiah. He isn't doing the things religiously he's supposed to. And others are saying, but what would you expect from a Messiah? Even more miracles than what you've got? So he must be the prophet. He must be the Messiah. Or just, who is he? Verse 43 says, thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Perhaps we don't fully grasp just how controversial a figure Jesus was in his day. Some were convinced, some thought he deserved to die, others just didn't know what to make of it all and promptly went back to their tent to celebrate the festival and to put him out of their minds. And isn't that the same today? So many different opinions about Jesus and who he is. Some based on personal experience of meeting him, some rejecting him outright without knowing a lot about him, some referring to him as some kind of rebel or just a teacher, or saying he's a prophet but nothing more than that. Maybe it's because he's too challenging, or there are others who just don't want to have an opinion at all. I remember asking the question out in the open, do you know him? People saying, I don't know if I want to. Instead, they just want to go and have another cup of wine. But in the midst of all this confusion about who Jesus is, all the varying opinions and ideas and unknowns, on the last and most significant high point of the festival, the last day, with the backdrop of the people celebrating God's life-giving provision in the desert, symbolized by the priest liberally pouring water and wine around the altar, Jesus stands up raises his voice and draws everyone's attention to him, and he gives an offer. If anyone is thirsty, come to me and drink. It's an incredibly powerful and potent moment, a kairos moment of choice. And he's referencing here maybe Isaiah 55 verse 1, where it says about come without money or cost, come if you're thirsty and I will give you living water. And then in the promise of the living, bubbling water of the Holy Spirit, he's referencing Ezekiel 47 and the river of life running out from God's throne to the world. And this is a major statement to make. He's interrupting the high point in the festival to make a really bold claim and offer. But opinion is divided yet again. But Jesus knows that he will be found out and he'll be believed in by those who truly want to seek God. Verse 17, actually, going back to that, says that anyone who chooses to do the will of God will actually find out whether my teaching is from me or actually is from God, whether it's made up or it's genuine. People will come and know who I am if that's who they're really seeking. Jesus is, in one sense, playing a very dangerous game. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. Remember, they're only blasphemous if they're not true. But these claims alienate him from those who think he doesn't fit their model of God and his Messiah. He's challenging people in their beliefs and their practices, especially in regard to their tradition, their identity and their law. And he's inviting people to have faith in him, whilst at the same time trying his best not to make himself a ruler by the force of power or popularity. Jesus is provoking, he's probing, he's challenging, knowing that where this will end up for him will be on a Roman cross. But only when the time and the conditions are right. Only when the right kairos moment comes.